Kent Adams here with experts at EWU. It's one of the programs I look forward to each month, and that is helping to tell the story of what's going on out at Eastern Washington University. And as an outsider, although I had a daughter who received her master's degree at EWU and so forth, but like so many of you, you know about it. It's kind of the local university here and so forth. But great things are going on out there, and I love this because I learn something new every time. I'm pleased to have Matt Anderson in. You are an associate professor of urban and regional planning. That's a mouthful, isn't it?
It is.
You can't be just called professor, right?
Evidently not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, you got this title. I hope they pay you in accordance to the title, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We were talking because you did some growing up in Southern California, where I did, and so forth, and you have family where in Chicago too, I think.
Chicago, yeah.
as well. But you went to one of the Claremont schools, right?
I did, yeah. I got my bachelor's degree at Pitzer College.
Okay.
Claremont, California, part of the consortium of
Yes.
colleges there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Out in the San Bernardino Valley area, right?
Yeah, right there, it's smack dab between LA and San Bernardino.
Right. I know the area well because I grew up in the Pasadena area. So,
Yes.
so we used to go out that way to go up to Big Bear and all of the
Yep,
mountain communities.
right, the Foothill Freeway.
Yes,
there,
yes,
210.
yes. Matt, let's talk a little bit about your background. You got your bachelor's there. What about master's? You work.
Yeah, I got my master's of arts in geography and environmental studies at Northeastern Illinois University.
Okay.
Which is just north side of Chicago. It's
So
where I
equal
was
time to
living.
California and Chicago.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it went back, and that's when I realized that I wanted to pursue academia. I wanted to go get my PhD. It took getting my master's to realize that. I didn't. It
Really?
was sort of an experiment. I was working at the time. After I finished, I went back home. My folks are in Chicago, still in Chicago. And I had a job as a research technician on a cancer research study at the University of Chicago.
Oh, wow.
And yes, sounds more, it sounds like something different than what the day-to-day experience was like.
That's
which
that's
was kind of
that's sometimes the case. isn't
yes.
it?
So sort of depressing a little bit, the subject.
Yeah.
And I saw my life flash before my eyes. Oh my God. So I'll try graduate studies, geography, right? I was always interested in that and didn't really have that available at Pitzer as a major. So this will be an experiment. So I didn't have any idea that I would end up doing this then. It took doing the master's degree to realize
Okay.
that this is what I wanted to
What
pursue.
clicked to tell you that, education might be where I want to go?
Well, I think two things. First, I think being exposed to certain ideas in a certain kind of way. It takes one, you can hear the same thing from multiple people, but, you can hear it from one person in a way where it clicks.
Yes.
And I think that's what happened.
Was there
for
that
me.
professor that did that?
Right, Dennis Gramenos at Northeastern Illinois University.
I hear that almost everybody has a named professor that allowed them to turn that light switch on.
Yeah, he did it, and I think it
Yeah.
also helped that it was is old enough. I mean, at this point, I took 3 years off between my undergraduate degree and starting my master's, and so I was 24, 25.
Yeah.
And I think at that point I was ready for this.
Okay, sure.
At 18, I wasn't really. I don't think for me I wasn't fully prepared to hear a lot of these ideas. Prepared for.
I think that's true for a lot of people.
I think it is.
Yes.
Some people are more prepared than others. I was not ready yet. So I think I heard a lot of the same ideas, right? And anthropology was my major. But I wasn't prepared to really be able to process and understand and appreciate what I was hearing until I was a little older.
In that master's degree.
Yeah.
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 Now, are you working on your PhD or?
No, I finished that. I got my
Oh.
PhD at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign,
Okay.
geography, and then applied for faculty positions. My first job was at Montana State University at
Okay.
Billings
Okay.
as a lecture position. Was there for 2 years. And then I got the job offer here at Eastern Washington University in 2014, and I've been here ever since.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Good for you. What's the number one thing you like about teaching and EWU?
The number one thing, boy, it's hard to answer. There's a lot of it I like.
And here I told you it'd be an easy question.
Yeah, well, so the first thing I think that I have to say is being in the classroom.
Yeah.
There's some days that you're kind of more in the mood than others.
Of course.
But, and some classes go better than others.
Yes.
But there's nothing better for me than being able to share the ideas, the knowledge that I have, that I'm passionate about, that I really enjoy, and being able to share that with other students, with
Right.
people in the classroom, and especially the more discussion-oriented courses,
Right.
The graduate classes. Everyone, it's what everyone wants to teach a graduate course,
Yeah.
because you get to have these sort of intimate discussions where you can go into considerable depth, and you can share all of this, and it's an enjoying process to be a part of sharing that, and with other students absorbing it and processing it.
Yeah. Can you see the light go off every so often?
You can, right? And sometimes they'll tell you that. But even if it doesn't, this is my job. I get to
Yeah,
talk about
right.
what I enjoy. And for me, that's the best. All the other administrative stuff, the
Oh, of course.
politics, goes out the window.
But we all
That's-
have that in
Yeah.
whatever job you have, okay?
Yeah.
That's just part of life, and you want to get rid of that and get that done and out of the way. But when you can walk in the morning and know you're going to see 20 or 30 or 15 or 10 students that might be asking some probing questions, you kind of want that, don't
Yeah,
you?
yeah. Those are the highlights of my
Yeah,
day when I'm
yeah.
in the classroom.
Yeah. You just recently, and I've got the article that was in the magazine, I think, out at Eastern. You really worked on the annual census of Spokane's homeless issue
Yes.
recently. And tell me about that, because it was just like a month or two ago, right?
Yeah, right. It just happened February 25th to March
okay.
1st. Usually happens in January.
Right.
They postponed it for a month.
Yes.
COVID, Omicron was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me about that. What was your involvement? What it was it like, and what did you learn? Did you learn some new things?
Yes. Yes, but for the most part, it confirmed a lot of what I already suspected.
Okay.
And already felt. So how it happened. My research is sort of all over the place. I've a number of different research areas that I've sort of spread myself a little too thin. One of the big
None of us
areas,
do that.
yeah, right, of course. But one of the areas that my research has led to is homelessness, and this is by way of an interest in housing market dynamics,
Right.
particularly in neighborhoods that are undergoing gentrification, where we see the process of neighborhoods transform from low-income communities to ones where more affluent people move in, and usually this means the displacement of those low-income
Yes,
people.
it does, yes.
The housing market dynamics that are part and parcel with that.
Yeah.
The role of monopoly, right, in particular amongst landowners and developers. So doing that, that was an area of my PhD dissertation, and then I took kind of a few years off of that and moved into water politics. And once that was done, I'm going to go back to the city,
Okay.
and this is what I want to do. And I initially studied that in Portland's Pearl District, and in the process of doing that, investigating doing the research for that study, I couldn't get away from homelessness. Homelessness was a topic that ended up being thoroughly involved in
Right.
that story. I couldn't not write that story without.
And this was a
including
few
it.
years ago.
This was a few years ago, 2019, and then in fact, what I did was all the homelessness material I just set aside for a totally separate study that I didn't plan to do, but I had it, and I became thoroughly engaged with it then, and now it's at the forefront of my research at the moment. So, look, long story short, right? So at Eastern, we have the Office of Community Engagement. Brian Davenport is responsible for this, so I should cite him because he put me in contact with Daniel Ramos down at the city of Spokane.
Right.
And he's one of the main coordinators of the point in time count every year for homelessness. And for me, yes, this is a great opportunity, and I had just brought in some new graduate students, both of them interested in housing and homelessness, and now the team of students has grown to 3 graduate students, and then there's a couple undergraduates who are now kind of working on the team with me. And so for me, this presented an opportunity to do something that is hard to do. You don't get the opportunity to do this, and that's to integrate service, community service and engagement, which we're supposed to do. But at the same time, incorporate teaching and mentoring students into something that is also going to be a research project. All 3 of those in the same activity.
Got to do the balancing act, yes.
Right. So I seized on that opportunity and saw this as a way to make key contacts. One, for the research that's we're in the process of doing, but also to give the students the professional experience, right? Put them into contact with shelter managers, service providers, people in the community. They both want to work in the Spokane area, and it's this professional, practical experience that employers really want to see.
And I'm going to guess here that our size community is a perfect size for all that too, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, to get you and your students directly to people that count, that are doing it on a daily basis.
And yes, absolutely. And especially in the context of homelessness, where this is a topic where we hear about it all the time. We see it, you're driving through downtown, you can't, and anymore, it's risen to such a degree where it's very visible. And talking about it, reading about it is all good and well, but then coming face to face with people who are out there, talking with them and engaging with them, that's a whole nother experience.
Yes, I can only imagine.
And you will learn a lot, right? You realize certain things that I think a lot of us tend to take for granted. These are real people, right? Who've lived, have had lives like us, and for whatever reason, can be a convergence. Usually it's a convergence of forces that leads to someone being unfortunate enough to being left out in the cold. And you realize this could happen to anybody.
I'm going to guess that going back 8 or 10 years ago, the folks that are homeless today, is it kind of a different breed than what we used to think of homelessness, being those who are kicked out of their rentals and so forth. Now we're dealing with some mental illness and drug abuse and some of those kinds of things. To me, and what I've seen on the streets, that seems to be more prevalent today. Am I right?
It's yes and no. Yes, in recent years for sure, and part of this is because
I'm thinking the last couple of years.
Yeah, the last couple of years, right. I think we've seen a surge in many different kinds of homelessness. That being one of them. And
it's not a one-issue
No,
campaign.
that's the thing. We like to, I think there's a drive amongst a lot of us to come to conclusions that are easy to wrap your head around.
And easy to solve.
Evidently easy to solve. But this is one of those problems that is notoriously difficult. And in the United States, it's particularly, we experience this phenomenon more acutely and on a greater level than most other industrialized countries,
Okay.
especially when you go to even just north into Canada, although it's a
interesting.
growing issue there.
Right.
But when you go to Europe, Western Europe, this is far less of an issue.
Wow.
They've managed to,
You know, I hadn't thought of it on an international level. I'm glad you brought that up because we
Yeah.
keep thinking, about our issues here, and that's what you read and hear and see and
Yes.
so forth. But
it manifests
what are they
differently
doing
here.
that we're not?
Oh boy, there's a lot to say there. A number of things. You have to sort of take it country by country. It manifests
Sure.
differently in different regulatory
But they're finding some
systems,
successes.
different housing market dynamics.
Yeah.
Yes, especially Denmark. Right, you
Okay.
go to a city like Copenhagen, and it exists, but on a far less. It's way less visible and it's way less of an issue. This has gotten worse across the world over the last few years.
Okay.
Since the Great Recession,
Right.
this has been, really kind of a global phenomenon. But some places it's far less of an issue. And Copenhagen's not a cheap city. Amsterdam is another one. Oslo, Helsinki,
Okay.
Finland, right?
Yeah.
Sweden comes up a lot, but this is a growing issue there too.
Yeah.
I don't want to sound like
That they've solved it.
this
No,
and
no,
that it's some
no.
paradise.
No.
But indeed, I think there's a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn from
Okay.
there. And one of the issues has to do with a lot. Let me take a big step back.
Yeah.
The big underpinning factors, at least based on the academic literature, and there's a huge literature on this.
Oh, wow.
That transcends disciplinary boundaries in geography, planning, but also in social work. It's a huge area. And it's studied from many different vantage points and in many different ways. And what we know is that the big structural underpinning variables has to do with housing,
Okay.
and it has to do with the labor market.
Okay.
So the wider the gap between wages and housing prices, the greater the numbers of people you see on the street.
Well, if you have a
It's correlated.
short supply, as we do right now,
Yeah.
you have people on the lower South Hill, not too far from me, where I had some rentals for low income for a while, are being bought up by young attorneys and others, and they're going in and fixing that. And you add that to the price of housing in Spokane, just to start with. But if you go into what might have been a $100,000 home, and you add $40,000 or $50,000 in a market that's going up by 30%, all of a sudden now you have the median price of $400,000. That puts a
is-
lot of people out of the market.
Yeah, it's
just plain
it's
does.
untenable, and
Yeah.
I think that's a big reason why you see a lot of the increase.
Okay.
It's not the only reason.
Right, clearly.
But it's one of the big, what I'll say, structural underpinning variables.
Yeah.
And especially in a country like the United States, where the housing market is driven by it's driven by the private sector. It's driven by developers. It's driven by people who are investing in housing, in property, because it's an investment. They
Right.
want it to appreciate in value. They're preserving that investment. It's mobilization of property toward profit. And that's all good and well, but what we've seen here is that without a substantive intervention in that, or some kind of regulation to ensure that there is some form of housing available to those who can't afford
Right.
whatever the going rates are, then inevitably you're going to see people out on
Right.
the streets. For one reason or another. This is one of those variables. It's evidently not a priority here. It's not as much of a priority as I would say it should be, and as it is in many other countries, especially when you go to Western Europe. And part of this has to do with, for me, there are those who might disagree or might point to something else. But back in the 1980s, the federal government started to defund city governments, right? City governments here used to receive federal funding to balance their budgets. That
Right,
was
right.
normal
Right.
until around the 1980s. You see this begin in the 1970s. The great headline, Gerald Ford to New York City, dropped dead, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And in the 1980s, the Reagan administration institutionalizes
Right,
this,
right.
including mental health institutions,
Right.
which suddenly, and that's the moment where I think we start to associate homelessness with mental illness.
Right.
Because we used to house these people in federally funded mental
Right.
institutions.
Yeah,
and
not too
those-
far from here.
Yeah.
Even.
So, and those provided shelter, at the
Right.
very least, for these people.
Right.
That kind of disappeared, and prisons, if anything, has become kind of the de facto mental health institution. And that's a whole nother story.
Yeah. We could do several segments
But,
here.
right. But what happens here, and then especially moving on post 1980s, is that, and this is at a time with deindustrialization, manufacturing sector in the U.S. kind of evaporated, and we've seen it
Went overseas.
Went overseas, jobs replaced by machines, that
Right,
kind of thing. And that underpinned a lot of urban economies,
Right.
especially in, the Rust Belt, the Northeast coast cities,
Right,
the Midwest. But
right.
now this is
Not
pretty
worth
much across
replacing.
the country, not
Yeah.
worth replacing. So that came with devastating impacts on the budgets and
Yes.
the revenue streams for
Yes.
city governments. And at this very time, Reagan pulls the plug. We're not going to fund you anymore. This is a kind of welfare,
Right.
that we're not going to do anymore. So it forced city governments to either become indebted, right, to Wall Street, which has happened, or start to find ways of encouraging people with money, employers with money and resources to come back to the city,
Right.
and developers.
Right.
Create more upper income housing to resuscitate revenue streams.
Right, right.
So city governments have been forced into an alliance with the private business sector, local business, and the real estate sector as well, developers. There's been an alliance, and almost out of a necessity for the city government. And it means then that funding anything that didn't generate tax revenue had to be subordinated.
Right.
Social welfare programs,
Right.
things that
It's
used to
just the
be there
cost.
for people that would otherwise become homeless have evaporated to some extent.
Yeah, and I know several developers, and we work with several groups in town and so forth. And one of the things I'll hear back from them is, look at what local governments have put on as restrictions of doing this kind of thing, not doing condos, the different rules, and not making it, putting a cost. I heard recently there's a cost of something like $38,000 more to a unit. Well, then all of a sudden that eliminates 2,500 people who could maybe afford,
Yes,
so it comes back from government as well. And then some even locally, complain about, we have a housing crisis, what are we going to do? But we're going to add this item that's going to cost the homeowner, the buyer now, $5,000 more. And who's going to pass it on? The builder.
Exactly.
The builder.
Right.
And I've had folks on who are builders who have said, I asked, how are things going? I'm just finishing up a project that we started a year ago, and this was several months ago when the price of lumber up for that house now has gone up $20,000. Guess who's going to eat that? Me as a builder.
Yeah.
And so it's tough. We putting everyone in, on the costs and so forth.
So we need to find a way to ensure that those who are most vulnerable to becoming homeless,
Right.
The poor,
Yes.
right? The one thing that the homeless population, the one thing most of them have in common is that they're typically poor before they became homeless.
Yes, okay.
So there are just as many homeless people that aren't mentally ill or on drugs or alcohol.
Okay.
We don't see them.
Yeah.
Because they blend in with the rest of the population. They're not acting or appearing in a way that is stereotypical.
But they go home
homeless.
at night not knowing how they're going to feed their kids.
Right, or they're living
Yeah.
in their car, or they're living somewhere. Either they're in a shelter or what have you. But we don't they're not visibly homeless to the rest of us.
Right,
So
right.
we don't, it doesn't register.
They're
that
not
these
up
people,
literally a block from here in sleeping bags
right.
when I go home.
Right, you
know?
don't see them,
Right.
right? That's the thing. And there are also, of course, many more people who suffer from mental illness and alcoholism
Yes.
and drug abuse that never become homeless. So when thinking about that, there are a lot of variables
Yes.
that enhance one's vulnerability, but substance abuse, alcoholism can't be the explanation. It's when when this kind of stuff afflicts the poor, they're most vulnerable.
Yeah.
They're
They're on the
they're
edge.
already there, and
Yeah.
it's because of this imbalance between wages and housing prices that makes the poor most vulnerable. And many, I've talked to many who, once, admitted that, boy, I used to hate the homeless. Never in a million years would I thought I would become homeless
Yes,
one day.
I've heard that too.
Any number of things can happen. Medical expenses
Yes.
can, right there. And if you're already paying too much for housing, and you have to make decisions about what's a priority, oftentimes people will move into their cars because you need that to get to your job.
Yeah.
And there's a growing phenomenon out there too of the working homeless, people who are employed but can't afford to live anywhere because they don't make enough money. I think there's a statistic out there where if you consider someone on minimum wage, and you consider paying over 30% of your income on housing as being rent burdened or
Right.
too much, you would have to be working some 60 to 70
Right,
hours a
right.
week to actually be
I've
able
heard
to
that too.
afford.
Yeah.
And for many people, it just takes one unfortunate event, some bill,
Sick child.
a sick child, something like that, and that's all it can take.
How do we best start addressing this issue? Because you've well pointed out that it's not a single issue. There are a lot of factors, but how can we go at this? I mean, I hear that when it gets really cold, we need places to send people to keep them warm in a bowl of soup or chili or whatever, kind of thing. That doesn't solve the long-term problem, though. And so I'm hearing and even you said it, there are a lot of needed answers out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, trying to find a way to say this
Yeah.
in a way that's not going to come across as crass. But in a capitalist economy and housing market, there is no incentive for the private market to produce housing for low-income people. There's every other kind of housing is more profitable than that.
Okay.
So what we've known throughout the history of planning, from the very beginning in the 19th century, the state has had to intervene in some way to ensure that those who are least fortunate and most vulnerable to being homeless have some
Government
shelter available to them, and it's
Yeah.
got to be subsidized by the state in some way. The private market won't build it.
Yeah.
Some significant incentives have to be provided, or the state has to directly intervene. And you see that way more in Europe, in Scandinavian countries. Vienna in Austria is, I would argue, is a good example to think of because they invest heavily in socialized housing. And it's not the crappy housing that we think of here,
Yes,
right?
yes, no.
We've
all seen that.
Yeah, they make it a higher end kind of product.
Okay.
And when you start, say you're on tough times and then you get another job and you're making more money. Here, you pretty much, then you're kicked out of public housing.
Yeah.
There, you get to stay.
Okay.
And these developments end up being mixed income in a kind of organic way. And
Which is a good
people
thing.
enjoy the house. It's not derided like it is here.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
invested.
Because we all kind of know where those places are, don't we?
Yes.
Yeah, you know what I mean?
Right.
We can drive by and go, okay.
Yes.
And we don't have to say it out loud, but.
You already know what the
Yeah.
projects,
Yeah.
right? And we've
Yes.
demolished them for the most part,
Yeah.
except for New York. They're pretty much gone. They were monstrous failures, the way
Yes.
we did it.
Yes.
But not necessarily in other places. Now, the big difference is a lot of cities in many European countries, especially, say, Denmark, right? Switzerland, Norway, Finland, the usual suspects. the severance of national scale funding to city governments never really happened to the same degree
Okay.
that it did here.
Okay.
I don't want to say it didn't happen. There's been reduction. The
Right.
UK has experienced this, France to a lesser extent, but it didn't happen there like it did here.
Okay.
It's continued to be a priority, and city governments have then been able to not have to rely so heavily on bringing in businesses
Right,
and
right.
developers coming in to gentrify neighborhoods to balance the budget.
Right.
So that's I
So-
think for me that's the big thing.
So more involvement from our city and county governments and
And giving them the capacity to be more
Okay,
involved.
okay.
The city governments usually get criticized for this, and
Yeah.
and a lot of that I think is right to do so. But at the same time, they've been forced into this situation. They've been disciplined to prioritize. They don't have the resources. They've been gutted of the
Right.
resources to serve this segment of the population.
And it's really tough for the private sector. I know of one owner that I've been introduced to via email and so forth that is putting up all of his low-income places for sale because it's not worth it.
Yeah.
you know? And so where's the help for him? Because, would he stay in business if there was maybe some more help or whatever? And they're reasonable, well-kept places. It's
Yeah.
not what we used to
Yeah.
think of as the projects and so forth.
Right. Costs go up and
But
suddenly.
100 and
yeah.
some families will be
Right.
facing someone else who's going to buy them and is going to charge more than $800 a month.
Right,
Yeah.
or they'll be turned into, for ownership, right?
Yeah.
And then reduce the number of units on the market.
Right,
And that, of
right.
course, has just a further upward pressure
That
on
doesn't
rents. It
yeah.
doesn't solve it.
Right.
So we.
But at the same time, you can't blame him because he's not making money.
Right.
I
right.
mean,
Yeah,
and-
you can't, right? And in many ways, you're forced into that situation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, he's not happy about
The
it.
broader
from what I'm told.
structural, processes here kind of have created this, and that's what we have to target. The public discourse seems to be focused on the homeless themselves and what they did to get them into this mess,
Right.
whether we should be doing anything about it, whether they deserve that kind of assistance. There's a demonizing rhetoric which makes it difficult then to
Right.
to implement the kind of structural reforms that I think we need to consider. That will, I think, actually tackle this. We've been a lot of the legal approaches have been to essentially criminalize the very act of being homeless. To be homeless, we've made it more difficult to exist without breaking some law,
Yeah.
with the hopes that they'll retreat, out of visibility.
Yeah.
And it hasn't happened though. It's worse today than it's been in,
Yeah.
definitely over 10 years, perhaps 30 years.
Is the city of Spokane, because you have worked with them on this project and so
right,
forth,
right.
is the city of Spokane able to help take this on and help lead? Because doesn't some leadership need to come from the city?
Well, yes.
And maybe it is.
Yeah.
I'm asking a question because I don't know. But I don't.
Yeah, well, I'm not in sort of the closed door rooms and meetings, but I think there is a genuine concern here. And back in early January, we had the convention center.
Yes.
Was used as a temporary warming station,
Right.
shelter of sorts. And my team and I were able to go down there and be a part of the bigger team that surveyed
Right.
those folks. And based on the questions that we asked, want housing, overwhelmingly, housing was sort of cited as the primary reason. But it revealed certain realities, right? For me, it confirmed, I think, what I already knew and suspected
Right,
in the
right.
literature. But for others who aren't necessarily familiar with that literature, it revealed
Probably
certain
an
realities.
awakening.
Yeah. So one, the need for more shelter space
Yes.
is crucial.
Okay.
But where are you going to put the shelter?
Yeah.
Right. Here's the.
Not-
no one wants the shelter.
Not in my
right next-
neighborhood.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the NIMBYism,
Yeah,
right,
yep.
ends up taking hold, and suddenly there's okay. We need to create more shelter space, but there's nowhere to actually do it.
Yeah.
That's sort of the dilemma. So yeah,
But you knew that was coming, right?
I'm not surprised.
No, okay.
Right. I'm not surprised, but it did, I think, generate the proper response that yeah, we need to at least do this. It's not going to solve the problem, but it's
Right.
at least going to substantively help those who are out there on the streets right now.
Right.
And the counter argument is, well, there's always empty beds at shelters. These people don't want to, they're saying no to shelters.
Right.
They want to be homeless. That's also misguided because a lot of the shelters are not necessarily
Low barrier.
a lot of people don't go there because of the reality of theft, violence,
Yep.
sexual assault.
Yeah.
They consider being on the street safer than actually going to
Yeah.
a shelter.
Because they can control
Right.
that situation.
And if
maybe.
you are if you feel like you're mistreated by any of the staff, all it takes is one bad experience.
Yes.
To then, yep, I'm not going.
Yeah.
I'm not doing that anymore.
I've
I'm not
experienced,
going-
yeah.
Yeah, and that's something I knew that before, but talking with people, I learned a little bit more
Yeah.
deeply about the dynamics going on there.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, fascinating topic.
Yeah.
We got into a lot more than I thought we would, which is good.
Yeah,
Because,
yeah.
because the one takeaway is there's no one answer. But the real answer is we need to work together to help the private sector where the private sector can be helpful. Maybe some joint projects. We need to look at more shelter space, especially for the rough times of year and so
Right.
forth. And I think some of that isn't some of that happening now. I think they're
Yes.
working toward that.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. This is this discourse is happening. We're talking about this
Yeah.
in ways that I'm not sure we really were this deeply
Okay.
in previous years.
So
There's
you-
reasons to be hopeful,
Yes.
but I think everything you said, yes, absolutely, all of that is needed. But
But-
if I'm gonna blame anyone, it's the federal government. I think needs to figure out a way to come back and give city governments the capacity to actually
Okay.
intervene in a way or sever the dependence on the private market for enhancing revenue
Right,
streams.
right.
The less dependent they are on the housing sector for this, the more it frees up then it opens up capacity for maybe incentivizing public housing more or building more socialized housing, taking up the lessons that I think we can learn from Europe.
Right.
And it's not just Europe. I hesitate to mention Singapore because it's
Okay.
a horrible authoritarian regime.
Yes.
Right. So I don't want to say this is, a
Yeah.
great country to look to or model, but you're not going to see very many homeless people out on the streets. And the state has a big role in the housing sector
Okay.
there. It's not cheap either, but there is enough of a system in place
Yeah.
to address this.
Well, in a housing market that's going up and limited and so forth, the contractors and others are going to spend most of their time on middle to upper income
Yep.
for their own self-interest. I mean,
Yes.
that's a given. You may or may not like that, but that's a given. So we need to find ways for maybe the public sector to be more active in this. I hear you saying maybe more federal involvement to support local government and so forth.
I think
and
that's
maybe
needed.
and maybe some of that is working with the private sector, but helping underwrite some of the losses that they might. You know what I mean? They're not going to do it for a loss.
You can't expect the private sector to
No,
do it for a
no,
loss.
no.
That's, I think, and that's why I think we've never really seen the private sector deliver
Right.
low-income housing.
Right.
We've attempts
Well,
to
you have
do
Catholic
this.
charities and some other groups that are private sector in the nonprofit.
Nonprofit. It has to be once you.
And that's maybe where it needs to be. In that part of the community.
Right.
Yeah, because the private for-profit sector right now has a job to do just for housing, it's regular housing for the rest of us.
Yes.
You know, for some of us that want to get out of our two-story house at age in our 70s to move into a condo or somewhere, there aren't choices
No,
out there,
there's
okay?
not.
And yet we have a house that could be 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, you know, my wife and I and our oldest son, who's Down syndrome, lives with us. But I mean, we could live in something smaller, but try to find it right now
Yeah.
without paying, you know, this price. You know,
No.
so if they can get to work on that part, then that'll help solve maybe some openings.
Well, it will. It'll bring, you know, the gap between wages and housing
Right,
down
right.
and make it less, make, you know, it less vulnerable, makes everyone less vulnerable
Yeah.
to suffering.
And I see the stories probably like you do on Facebook and other places where someone's $800 a month is going up to $1,700 for rent and things like that. And I mean, who can sustain that kind of an increase? I don't care.
It's
Basically,
not.
what kind of money you make,
Yeah.
you know, that's,
So we know this well from the Great Recession,
Yeah.
and even when cost of living goes up and continues to go up, but wages are relatively not going up, the gap can only get so wide
Right.
before we're looking at a
crash.
catastrophe.
Yes, yeah. Matt, thank you. I learned a lot. I hope our viewers learned a lot too.
Okay, I hope so,
And
yeah.
keep us informed because where can people go right now to get more information? Is there information out there other than the news, local news media? I know is covering
Yeah.
homelessness and so forth. Are they telling the full story?
Yes and no. I think yes. The story that's being told is the immediate problem.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
The broader, you know, the sort of the history that I
Yes.
tried to paint in this probably oversimplified way.
Yeah,
is
but
really
we
so
haven't
much
heard much of
time.
that.
Right. You don't hear that much.
No.
You don't hear about, you know, what's led to this.
Right.
And the unfortunate side of this is it leads to simple explanations that they're all mentally ill and suffer
Right.
from, you know, substance abuse. That's a big problem, but that's a variable for sure. It's an issue, but
Right.
that doesn't explain the problem.
Okay.
Even if no one did that, we'd still have people out there, and there are just as many who don't suffer from that.
Yeah.
So I think if there's another big thing that needs to change is I think the rhetoric that demonizes
Yes.
these
Yes.
people. They're human beings like
Yes.
everyone else, and you realize that when you're talking to them, right? There's this tendency. This is unfortunate, and it leads to then lack of support for.
Well, and we don't
kind
want to
of
be
things.
involved because we don't want to get near that either.
Yes,
sometimes,
it's
okay?
uncomfortable. Yeah,
Yes.
you don't want to,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And this is another reason. A lot of the times you'll find who we talk to, people who are certainly sound of mind, talking to us in a very coherent manner,
Right.
telling us that they don't do drugs, and this being one of the reasons they don't go to the shelters because they don't want to be around it or see it either.
Okay.
Right, and that, you know, okay, I
Yeah.
hadn't thought of that before, you know, right?
We
It makes
need-
sense though,
Yeah,
right? But these are the guys that you don't think
No,
of. You don't
yeah.
see these people.
Thank you so much
Yeah.
for educating all of us out there because we're concerned. I think a lot of us are wondering what we can do. I think part of it is to study a little bit more, to get to know some of the things that you talked about today.
Yeah, read. You know, a lot of this is coming from, you know, the academic literature
Right.
that a lot of people aren't familiar
No.
with.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
That you have to be in a university, right, to get exposed to this. That's the only reason.
Right. Right.
That I'm familiar
Well,
with.
keep on it, okay?
Yeah.
Thank you,
Will
and
do.
to you and your students. Matt Anderson, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
Most welcome.
It's been a
Thanks for watching.
joy.